Hi, everyone. This is Craig Zelizer here back for season 13, episode 1 of the Social Change Career Podcast. Today, we're talking with John Marks about From Vision to Action, Remaking the World Through Social Entrepreneurship. This is his new book, which is coming out in about a week. So this is a preview. And John is the founder of Search for Common Ground, the largest independent peacebuilding NGO in the world. Under his leadership, the organization grew to offices in 35 countries and over 600 staff working long-term in some of the world's most challenging conflicts. He's worked around the world in partnership with many leading political leaders, organizations, NGOs, governments, foundations. Search was nominated for the Nobel Prize in 2018. Beyond his work with Search for Common Ground, he also is a Skoll awardee for social entrepreneurship and an Ashoka Senior Fellow. He's also a visiting scholar in peacebuilding and social entrepreneurship at Leiden University in the Netherlands. He's currently based in Amsterdam with his wife, Susan Collin Marks. He's also an accomplished author known for his books on intelligence and peacebuilding, including The CIA and the Cult of Intelligence and the award-winning Search for the Manchurian Candidate. His new book, again, the title I read earlier, comes out next week from Columbia University Press, and it explores his career lessons, learnings, and recommendations from working in decades of negotiation, conflict resolution, and social entrepreneurship. I will put the link in the chat. He's also the founder and managing director of Confluence International. And I do have to say, I've interfaced and collaborated with many search staff over the years. And I've been fortunate to know John and his wife, Susan, and the current head of search, and had a number of search students, staff as students of mine. And really, the organization has been committed to doing the hard, long slog and joyful work and difficult work of peace building through creativity, empathy, innovation, and just persistence. So very excited to have John here to launch our season. And for people who have not joined the podcast previously, this is live streamed. We really enjoy hearing your comments. So particularly on LinkedIn, in the chat, put a few comments letting us know where you're watching from. And throughout the session, feel free to add questions and comments, and we'll try to weave them in throughout the episode. This will be converted to one of 150 plus episodes of the podcast on Friday. So you can find it on PCN Global or any major podcasting platform. And 3 quick requests before we get started. Please follow John on LinkedIn, Search for Common Ground, Confluence International. Please consider sharing and rating the podcast. It helps grow our impact, and we have an amazing season lined up for this year. And please think about following PCDN. That's it for the intro. So John, thank you so much for your wisdom and taking time to join us today. And as we were discussing prior, I just finished reading the book, and it's a wonderful, it's super exciting. It's wonderful to read. There's a lot of humor, and the lessons of your kind of 10 or 11 lessons for social entrepreneurs. And just to start off with, can you talk about the book and what you hope the impact of it will be? And did you have fun writing it, and stuff like that?
Well, I very much enjoyed writing it. And incidentally, thank you so much for having me on this podcast. You're doing great work, Craig, and I really, really appreciate it. So beyond that, the book was, for me, fun. What wouldn't be fun about going back over your life and writing the experiences and down and putting together some principles that might govern what the kind of work that I was doing. And it turned out to be a labor of love that I enjoyed very much. And let me tell you, the previous 2 books I wrote before, I didn't enjoy very much writing them. I always thought that a book was more than you wanted to know about anything. But this one, I guess because it was so personal and so much about the experiences that I had enjoyed, I really liked it.
Okay. And in terms of what do you hope? I mean, the audience of this can be quite broad, whether it's peace builders, social entrepreneur, diplomats, business people, foundation leaders. What do you hope people might get out of the book? I mean, that's kind of a hard question because obviously each person is going to interpret differently. But if you had to say, reading this book, you hope this will be the result for a broad audience.
Well, I have 40 years of experience in this book, and it's my legacy. And I would like to leave behind some of the things that I learned. And my sense is if I hadn't written them down and made them available, they would have faded away. And this way, there's some chance some of these things will survive. And I think there's some insights and there's some constructs that could make a real difference for other people. And that's the reason I did it. But more
Mm-hmm.
than anything else, it was my legacy that I
Mm-hmm.
would like to have leave behind. Now, Search for Common Ground is also my legacy. I founded it and headed it for 32 years, and it's still the largest peace building NGO in the world. And I leave that behind too. And a lot of the things that I started still go on. The vision is the same as it's always been. But I'd like to leave all of that behind.
Okay. And I remember, you were a visiting guest scholar at Georgetown. So I remember you gave a series of lectures to students and faculty and guests, and the principles you outline in your book. I mean, I think you've been working on them for decades, but you presented most of them. And if I had to summarize how I interpret your book, is that advancing sustainable change in the world takes grit, determination, innovation, creativity, humility, partnerships, the ability to be a forward strategic thinker, but also deal with the always unknown things, and that no matter what you plan, things are going to come up both good and challenging, and that a true innovator and social entrepreneur needs to be flexible but keep true to the vision, and also that this work can't be done solo. Like, it takes strong partnerships and collaboration. And if you think back to earlier in your career when you started out, you were in the State Department, um, and then you were very critical and resigned and did a lot of critique of the U.S. government. But if you think back to your younger ages, or as your teenage years, what did you envision yourself doing professionally? Did you have a vision that you always wanted to work in international affairs, or how did you wind up getting into international affairs in the beginning?
Well, I did always think I would work in international affairs. At 22, I joined the State Department, the Foreign Service, and I, I was one of the very few people who went off to Vietnam for a first assignment. And frankly, I went to Vietnam to avoid the draft. In other words, I was going to be drafted. And by going to Vietnam in the Foreign Service, I was able to stay out. But I always wanted to be doing something internationally. And what changed was my methodology and my adaptation to where I was. I went through after the state. I left the State Department in protest. I went to work for U.S. Senator Clifford Case of New Jersey, and it was the Case Church Amendment, which was my responsibility within the office, that ended the Vietnam War. They cut off funding for the war. And that was something I did with great pleasure. And after that, I wrote a couple of books, which were also about foreign policy issues, intelligence issues. And then I founded Search for Common Ground. And it took me a while to find out what I really wanted to do with my life, but the overwhelming part was to work in foreign policy.
Okay. And for people, this is one of the things that's really interesting, I think, about your career in the book, in terms of you started, let's say, in the system, at least in terms of formal diplomacy. Then you went a little bit outside. Then you really worked strongly outside the system. But then, as you talked about, describing some of the work in the late 80s between the Soviet Union and the US, is really, that you invited former heads of the CIA to participate in things. some of the track two dialogue or track one and a half dialogue. So one of the questions for yourself and also for other professionals, what are your thoughts about people as they're building a career, the advantages of being directly in the system, whether that's private sector, government, or foundations? And you chose to resign from the State Department. With the war in Gaza, a few people have resigned. I remember the war in Bosnia, some people have resigned. But that tension between being in the system and knowing when it might be better to be outside and challenging it, and just any reflections on your own career, how you made those decisions, and for others who are trying to decide whether they stay in a bureaucracy and affect change from the inside or go outside.
Well, my days in the Foreign Service, in the government, were very useful to me in learning how things function. And when it became impossible for me to remain because my gut told me that I disagreed too strongly with the policy, I left. But the knowledge I gained, which was quite important. So I would suggest that people should stay in or go in and learn. They may not want to make that a lifetime career, but it's quite useful. And every place that I worked, in the State Department, on Capitol Hill, as an investigative reporter, all those experiences went into my becoming a leader of an NGO. And I hadn't realized it, but I've been in training with those previous careers for what I was going to do later on. And it was the composite of all those career opportunities, all those experiences, which I think allowed me to be fairly successful as an NGO leader.
Mm-hmm. And your advice for people who, let's say, because we talk to a lot of professionals from all over the world who, whether they're in marketing or fintech or foundations, who are confronted with that choice of they're in a system that maybe they don't want to be part of anymore, but it's everybody needs to pay the bills. And so any thoughts, like when you decided to leave the State Department, did you know what was coming next? You just knew that you couldn't do it anymore? And how long did you stay inside in Vietnam? And did you have these questions about the ethics of the war from day one, or like what led to that decision to change?
Mm. No, I didn't have any opposite high level opposition to the war in the beginning, but I served in Vietnam, and then I served in Washington, overseeing many things that had to do with Vietnam, and it just gradually grew upon to me that the war was essentially wrong and needed to be ended. And that became a very strong view, but it was an evolving view which came from my own personal experience. It didn't come from just reading about it. It came from being in it and spending 18 months in Vietnam myself, where I saw not only was the policy ineffective, but I felt it was wrong. And for me, the last straw was the invasion of Cambodia when the United States went to Cambodia in 1970. And I think in retrospect, I wish I had resigned that day, but I waited a few months till I got another job. I was cautious about it. And that's, I think, probably a normal kind of reaction. But I was more cautious now than I wish I had been in retrospect.
And can you talk a little bit when you first went to Saigon in terms of your day-to-day responsibilities? So were you an economic affairs officer? Were you, what were your responsibilities, and how much were you in the capital versus outside?
Well, actually, I wasn't in the capital at all. I was
Okay.
loaned or put on assignment to the USAID,
Okay.
the Agency for International Development. And I was what was called a New Life Development Officer in a
Mhm.
small provincial capital about 60 miles from Saigon, a very dusty, hot place. And I
Mhm.
spent my first year there, and I was responsible for everything for helping refugees, providing assistance to the medical establishment there, the hospital, those kinds of things, for which I had no training. I was 22 years old at the time, and I had 3 weeks of what was called area studies. So
Uh-huh.
I didn't really know what I was doing, but it was heady stuff. And there was an assumption it was because I was an American, I somehow knew about these things.
Mhm.
But that was one of the fallacies in the pacification program, which I was a part of. Um, and then I spent the last 6 months of my tour in Saigon at the military headquarters, where I was a plans and program officer. And
Mhm.
in my section, which was full of colonels, Army colonels, I was the only one who'd ever actually lived in the field. So I was the only one who had any idea what we were doing planning for.
Mhm. And did you develop Vietnamese language skills?
No, I spoke French when I went,
Okay.
and
Yeah.
that was
Okay.
at the time was perceived to be enough. It certainly limited the number of people you could talk to because it was
Mhm.
only a very small upper crust who spoke French. But I never did learn Vietnamese.
Mhm. And then if I mean a question, this is a much bigger question, more reflecting on the your overall career. But the US, I mean, if you listen to the either the Republican convention or the Democratic convention, there's so much talk about the US as the strongest military in the world. And, we need to be lethal. And we're spending almost $1 trillion a year on war defense. And thinking back to Vietnam, what why is war so sellable and why is peace so hard to sell? Is it
Well,
because I mean, not that peace is hard to sell, but it's, like what are your reflections about that kind of there's still a huge imbalance even though there's more investment in peace than let's say 40 years ago.
mhm. Well, we as a country have tied war up with patriotism, and that becomes very sellable. Where peace is soft, and it's. I think most Americans are in favor of peace, but they also want the country to be strong, and they want to, to have the flag be very important, and it is. But the fact is that we don't do a very good job as a species in selling peace. And, we spend close to $1 billion on the Pentagon and virtually nothing on learning about how to make peace. The U.S. Institute of Peace was supposed to bridge that gap, but it hasn't. And also, it hasn't had anything like the resources needed to make a real difference in the world.
Yeah, I mean, for people who are from outside the US, or even if people are not from the DC area, the US Institute of Peace, it's interesting, was actually created under Reagan, I think in 1984. I forgot the exact year. And took a couple of years to get into operation. Their budgets maybe it's gone up and down, but maybe between 30 to $50 million a year, maybe a little bit higher. And if you compare that to the amount of money that's spent, USAID itself is about 40 billion. Again, defense is about $1 trillion. So there is a fundamental misallocation of resources. If you do happen to be in DC, or even if you're not, like it's a great resource just to. They do have a lot of good events and convenings and open houses. Um, this is a question, because you talk about in your book about the need to be a good storyteller, and and so since you've been working on advancing common ground, and I never knew the story about act in the commonalities in terms of that phrase, how you came about that. So it's wonderful to hear in the book. But if you think about why is the world getting better at making peace, or are countries getting better at making peace, or are skills getting more sophisticated, or we're still kind of fumbling around in the dark and peace is just like this notion that hippies should go out and hug trees, and like it's like are we better at being more peaceful at some levels? Or I mean, I can tell you're an optimist because you wouldn't have done this work for so many years, but if you think about the course of your career and our ability to really work on deep rooted, you know, let's say intractable problems, are we getting better at that, or is the world, you know, how do you reflect on that kind of challenge?
Well, I think the world is getting better at the methodology of making peace, but it's getting worse at applying it. In other words,
Mm-hmm.
the methodology is mostly there, and it's improved quite a bit in the last 20 to 40 years. But what's happened is it's not applied usually. Making peace is not something that seems to be talked about at any great length in the annals of government. And, mediation works, conflict resolution works, all these kinds of things. But the field itself has not taken on the prominence that I think it should and it deserves to have.
Mm-hmm. And there's so many stories and examples in your book of bringing together groups or people or diplomats or communities that have been in really hard conflict, often involving violence or polarization, where you and the partners and team at Search, and of course always locally led, would find these creative ways to bridge differences and create yesable options and to try to find ways to work together. And I mean, I remember this from years ago. I mean, I know Susan Cochise, and she used to talk about in Burundi the Festival of Heroes, which you talk about, that Rwanda had the genocide. Burundi had a lot of the similar underlying conditions around ethnic divide, polarization, and bad political leadership. And one of the really interesting Search and your partners did is to try to celebrate the people who crossed boundaries and worked with each other and used the power of music and stories. And what are some of your favorite examples from the book or your career of where the challenge has seemed absolutely insurmountable? Like, just there's no way any change could ever be imagined. And through, in part, a process that you were involved in, that light opened and something transformed beyond just the relationships that led to a systems level change, a relations, some kind of change that really led this previously unsurmountable challenge, that there something changed. Like, what are some of your favorite examples around that?
Well, you mentioned Burundi. We went into Burundi about 6 months after the genocide in Rwanda. And Burundi had the same mix of Hutus and Tutsis, in other words, the same ethnic mix. And we went into Burundi at a time when thousands of people were being killed every month, but it had not yet reached the level of genocide. And we were able to do things. We set up a radio studio, which produced about 15 hours of programming a week, which would showcase people coming together. We used soap opera, we used music. We had a national drumming contest. We worked with young people who were in militia. In essence, they were killers, and we were able to defuse them. And in the course of doing that, we were able to essentially bring about a change, it seemed to me, in the culture of the country, and to make much more difficult the idea of killing somebody just because that person was from a different ethnic group. And it was quite a successful program. Now, you can't say, it's very hard to prove a negative, to prove that something didn't happen because of what you did. But I can safely say, in my opinion, that thousands, if not tens of thousands of people didn't die in Burundi because of this programming that we were carrying out.
Okay. Okay, so thanks so much. So, a question from Lucine. Greetings from Yerevan. It's great to be part of the podcast. Would you have any suggestions for folks who are interested in contributing to international initiatives involving change and transformation? How to find them, how to get engaged, and share their expertise?
Well, it's difficult to put together the expertise. So I think the best way to get started is to work with an existing organization, and sometimes even as a volunteer or an intern. And that's to my mind, the entry level position. And of course, that's difficult to do because so many of the internships are unpaid. But people need to probably make some sacrifices to get into the field. Uh, there are probably several hundred universities that have courses or majors in peace building or um, conflict resolution, and they're graduating thousands of people a year, and there just aren't jobs for them in the field. It doesn't exist. So you need to get with somebody who already is involved with this kind of thing and learn. And I think apprenticeships are the best way to actually learn. And in some parts of the world, that just isn't possible. So I'm giving you a very difficult hill to climb. But there's going to take a bit of a sacrifice to get into this field.
This is a question you and I have discussed, and I just actually let's going back to Lucine's question. So, what are some I think one of the wonderful things the past 30 years in the field of peace building is there's now networks, both global networks and regional hubs, and funders networks and NGO networks and donors networks. So, 30 or 40 years ago, there were very few organizations directly working. I mean, there was Search for Common Ground, Partners for Democratic Change, and of course, lots of local organizations. But now there's networks. Alliance for Peace Building, European Peace Building Liaison Office, WANEP in West Africa. We have networks in Colombia, the UN United Network of Youth Peace Builders. So, if someone, let's say, is really interested in these areas, but they don't know where to go, which networks would you recommend they start to investigate to find healthy, reasonable organizations?
Well, the first thing probably is to decide, are you going to work in your own country or do you want to work internationally? And probably for learning, working in your own country works better as a start. In the United States, a good place to start is in the mediation in the courts. Most jurisdictions in the United States have some mediation process, and usually which are used to lighten the dockets in the judicial system. And in some states, you have to go to mediation before you can get a divorce. That's true in California, I believe. And their mediation training programs at most local jurisdictions or in local universities. The Northern Virginia has one, as I remember, which we used to send people to. And you get trained for a couple of days and then get some practice in mediation. And that's quite useful later on because then you have the ability, some skills to move forward. And looking for those opportunities is the best way to get into the field properly. Um, and having that kind of experience, if somebody came in to me and we were interviewing for a job, I would be very impressed if they had gone through mediation court training in the local courts. Now, that may not be available in Yerevan or everywhere, but in most parts in Western Europe and the United States, it is available.
Yes. Yeah. And if you're in the US, the National Association for Community Mediation is a great resource. It's a network of maybe 200 to 300 community mediation centers, including the one that you referred to, Northern Virginia Mediation Services, which is one of the strongest ones. But there are networks around the world of
Mm-hmm.
local, both formal, where it's actually integrated into the formal justice system and informal systems. And then, United for Youth in, let's say, Central and Eastern Europe or anywhere, United Network of Youth Peace Builders does a lot of great work in convenings. And, there's lots of great resources. So going back, you made the question, I think, I don't remember if I interviewed you or someone else at Search. I think it was you many years ago. I did a report for the precursor to Alliance for Peace Building. It used to be called Alliance for International Peace Building and something else before it became AFP. And I think you said that Search doesn't need people filled with theory. You need people that know how to do things and apply. And, someone else at USID said this to me many years ago, senior, that often in the real world, it's not the choice of the ideal option, it's the choice of the least worst option. And so one of the questions, if someone is watching or listening to in the future, you've talked about apprenticeships, and in your book, you list a wonderful set of skills and aptitudes that would be useful for anybody going into the change making business, whether it's in peace building or something else. Do you advise, if someone comes to you and they're a very idealistic young peace builder doing really good work, do you and they say, is grad school, let's say they have a bachelor's. I mean, you don't necessarily need to have any degree, because often the best peace builders learn from experience and reflection. But do you advise people to consider graduate degrees? You're a professor, visiting professor. So what are your thoughts when people come to you and say, will a graduate degree help me get the skills and experience to get a job that's meaningful, but also will cover my bills?
Mhm. Well, I think that graduate degrees are useful in terms of teaching skills. I think apprenticeships are probably more useful for just hands on skills. But those advanced degrees are very useful in helping you get a job. People are impressed by them. I looked at resumes very carefully when I was hiring people, and despite what I'm saying, I usually hired the people who had sort of the most loaded resumes, and I think that's quite useful. I don't think particularly that PhDs in the field make much of a difference because they get to be so technical and so obtuse. And I would feel that stop with the masters and then use it as a lever to get into an organization, to get a job, it might start with an internship. Um, in the Washington area, George Mason had a very, very successful and active school of international conflicts, now called the Carter School, after Jimmy Carter. And we used to hire half a dozen people a year from there. And so I believe we were the largest hirer of graduates around. And, it shows that people are interested, they're committed. I think the key here is to have a vision of what you want to do with your life, have a real vision, but then to be an applied visionary, to
Mm-hmm.
find ways to apply it one step at a time. And it takes both that vision and being able to apply it to be effective in the world, it
Mm-hmm.
seems to me.
And if you think back to your time leading search and growing from a staff of one or two to 635 countries, what are some areas? Because often when people think about change work, they want to do the front lines work of convening, advocacy, policy, but so many roles are required to do this work. Graphic designers and accountants and finance and communications. And when you think about to your career, where there's certain areas where you needed talent, you had the hardest time finding talent. Like there was always, an amazing pool of people applying to do X, but what you really often would need was people doing Y. So if you think about your career leading search or where you see the field going, are there any particular skill sets that you would encourage people to either focus on or develop that are likely to lead to more stable employment?
Hmm. That's a very tough question.
Mm-hmm.
It clearly depends on the organization. When we had 6 or 10 people in the organization, life was more fun. Yeah, you got to know everything that was going on, and then as it grew and grew, there got to be much more bureaucracy. There became rules that you had to follow. People wanted to know about pensions and holidays and things like that, and things somehow when organizations are small, they're more mobile, they're more agile, they're more flexible, and they're more able to accomplish things. And as they grow, they lose some of that. And I saw that in my own personal experience. On the other hand, if we hadn't grown, and we knew it was happening, if we hadn't grown, we wouldn't have been able to be in 35 countries or be a force around the world or whatever. And so it was a choice we had to make, and we had to find the right mix between administration and actually being able to do things. And it seems to me that there are probably two poles in the management area. The first is what I liked and what I enjoyed was I would call adaptive management. That is, I would adapt to the situation. I wouldn't depend so much on planning as what's the opportunity that just presented itself and go on. And then the other end of the spectrum is what might be called management by rules, where you have thick, the government has hundreds of books which tell people what they can do and can't do. And every organization needs rules and it needs to be able to adapt. But finding the right mix is hard. And as organizations get bigger or more entrenched, they become much more rules based and much less able to adapt to situations as they change. And it's why uh, organizations that used to be so big and successful in the profit and the nonprofit area, after a while, start to lose their effectiveness and even go out of business.
Mhm.
Think of Polaroid cameras and stuff, or Kodak film, or
Or
whatever.
Sears or J.C. Penney.
Exactly.
um,
And
so
it's
is,
it's true, and you could keep telling them and telling them, but it doesn't make any difference. They don't change. And I certainly, most entrepreneurs are very much on the adaptive side. They like to run things off the seat of their pants, not in accordance with strict rules or planning or whatever.
Mhm. Is there another book coming out in the future just on management, adaptive management, chaos, and change?
I don't. I think I've written my last book, and
Uh,
we're talking about it. I'm 81 years old at this point. I'm not sure I'm ever going to do another book. This will be my third.
okay. So, a question: if you think from the organizational leadership and adaptive, because I agree. I used to think if I could get to the right position, not of power, but authority, that I would have the more ability to affect change. And there's some truth to that, but I've also become increasingly convinced the many people are so caught up in the bureaucracy that it's hard once you're in the system and the bureaucratic system. It's also harder to make change in some ways. And so, any thoughts from your experience at Search for anyone leading an organization, whether it's 5 people or 1,000? What are some ways to keep that joy and adaptability in the system? Because obviously there needs to be rules for donors and finance and human resources. But what do you think at Search? What I think most years you had. I don't know if you used to call it Big Week, where you bring in a certain amount of staff from around the world. But like, what helped keep Search somewhat nimble and adaptable within this bureaucracy?
Well, I can't speak for it after I stepped
Yeah.
down about 10 years ago, and I won't. But I'll give you some of the tricks or some of the methodology that I used. I always kept my hand in individual projects. In other words, particularly in the Middle East, I love to be able to close my door and talk to people about how we were going to put together individual programs on a complicated way. And I would in essence serve as the desk officer, the program officer for projects, even when I was running an organization with 600 people in it. And that kept me in, and it kept me in what I considered to be fun in the organization. For me, doing budgets and compliance and large scale administrative wasn't particularly fun. And it's important to keep your sense of fun. I traveled to post a lot. I could keep up on what was going on. And that was an important thing for me. And then I was also able to defer satisfaction from one place to another. If usually the projects you were working on weren't doing all that well, or there would be setbacks. Peace building is kind of like a roller coaster, lots of ups and downs, and I don't like downs. I mean,
Mhm.
they're not my favorite thing. I like ups. So
Mhm.
what I would do is if some project got into a bad state or wasn't moving forward, which always happened, I would look to others that we were doing to get my satisfaction. In other words, well, we're not doing very well in the Middle East, but in the Congo, we're doing pretty well. And hey, that's great. And I would talk about the Congo and I keep that in my sets. So I had a lot of ways of doing this, but probably the biggest would be what I call the Aikido approach. Aikido is a martial art, a Japanese martial art, where if an attacker comes at you, it's not like boxing where you try to knock them back on their rear end. What you do is you accept the energy, you blend with the energy as it is, and you try, instead of not reversing the energy by 180 degrees, you try to deflect it by 10 degrees or 20 degrees. And by doing that, you sort of let the awful part pass. Uh, but accepting current reality and working to change it in small ways is probably what people like I can do, can succeed at. And that was my approach.
Okay, thank you so much. So, next question comes from Eric in Kenya, and I'll just summarize it. So, he's saying he talks about the connection between climate change and conflicts. And do you have any suggestions for people who are want to work on international initiatives through the lens of waste management from destroyed infrastructures? So whether so that so some kind of infrastructure, obviously Gaza is a horrible example, but just of often conflict or natural disasters create a lot of environmental impact. And just, are you aware any organizations doing that kind of work around, let's say, military destruction or waste, or environmental destruction and waste from a peace building perspective?
I don't know anybody who's doing it from peace building constructive. Environmental groups are working on those kinds of issues. And I think there could be much more peace building, conflict resolution in that field. Um, but people, for the most part, want to take direct adversarial action against polluters and the like. And that's not a bad thing necessarily, but it's not peace building.
Yes, yes. So this is an interesting example. Catalina, my wife, and I do small scale angel investing, and this is not necessarily a peace building example, but it's a very creative win win approach. There's a company we did a small investment in. In the U.S., when trees fall down in cities, they used to take them all to landfills. And lots of cities plant trees to help keep better environment, cooler air. And so this company, I think it's called Cambium Carbon, what they do is they take trees that are falling in cities and they pick up the trees and they turn them into wood products accessible in the local market. So it's not a conflict thing, but it's a really creative thing where you had this waste that was just accumulating, and they turn into a win-win both for cities and for business. So it's a cool example. And I want to go back to a movie that you helped produce called Under the Same Sun, which I've screened many times. And it's not exactly addressing Eddie's question, but if you can talk a little bit about, I mean, because one of the, Search is the leading organization in the world, and you're one of the leading experts. And you talk about this in your book about how to use different forms of media and relevant local context, the stories, to both create attitudinal change and behavioral change. And so, one, can you talk about a little bit in the book? You give lots of examples, whether it's the team, which is using, let's say, edu-drama in sports, or Madam President. So, if you can talk both, first starting off about Under the Same Sun, what that movie is about, since it touches on environmental issues, and then a little bit about the power and limitations of media in building, common ground.
Mhm. Well, Under the Same Sun was a film we produced with a Palestinian director and an Israeli producer. So it was a joint production in itself. Um, and it was about two businessmen, one Palestinian, one Israeli, who come together and start a solar energy company. And both of them get trashed in their home area for collaborating with the other side. and they come to see that if they're ever going to be successful in their business, there needs to be peace in the region. In other words, there needs to be a context where cooperation is okay. And so they go on Facebook and they set up a model idea for peace, and they say citizens should be involved. And tens of thousands of people join their Facebook um, effort. And in the end, the politicians wind up making peace. Obviously, this is a fable, but what we were trying to show was that it was possible to do this. And the film was shown on both television in Israel and in Palestine. And that didn't happen very often, but we had connections on both sides, and we were able to get it on the air in both cultures. And I saw um, film, television particularly, as a way of reaching large scale audience. When I started out with Search, we used to do workshops where we might have 30 or 40 people, or trainings with a comparatively small number of people. And I wanted to reach millions of people. And I saw that the workshop format wasn't it, though you can certainly do good things with workshops for a limited number of people. But I saw that to reach the kind of audience I wanted to reach, I needed to be able to have get into the media in a major way, because that was the only way. And when Search was just, I think we may have had 3 or 4 employees, I had cards made which said I was president of Common Ground Productions. Now, there was no such thing as Common Ground Productions except on those cards. But the kind of people who make cards, the printers, don't care about your credentials. You don't have to prove anything to them or show them proof that you are what you say. And actually, by having cards made which said I was president of Common Ground Productions started to take on reality. And within about 3 years, we had a show on public television in the United States called, of all things, Search for Common Ground. And it was a talk show, and we were able to put it together. Um, and luckily, it worked, and that allowed us to get into other forums. And we also saw that talk shows, while useful and better than nothing, were not reaching huge audiences. And we moved into drama soon, and I used to call it soap opera for social change. And over the years, I think I produced or executive produced over 500 programs, episodes of dramatic television. And the idea was that by showing something in a dramatic context, for example, a coexistence between ethnic groups or religious groups, and doing it with good drama, you could reach people in a way that you couldn't by trying to teach them about these things, by being didactic. And we were very successful, we felt, in making this go. And one of my regrets is after I stepped down, this kind of programming has not been followed up on. And
Hmm.
Search doesn't do it anymore on a major scale for broadcast. And nobody else or very few in the world are doing it. And that one of the reasons I wrote this book, as you asked me before, was I would like to see that kind of programming um, expanded and taken out to a much larger audience. And
Yes.
you can remember in the United States, there was a program called All in the Family. Archie Bunker, he
Yes.
was the poster child of bigotry and intolerance. And because of that show, it seemed to me that the country moved to a great extent away from bigotry. And it had a great impact. And you can take other areas like LGBTQ rights, which television seems to have had a big part of, and attitudes towards other social issues. And I think working in that way is a very fertile area for anybody who wants to go into the field. And actually, you asked me earlier about what places which people didn't come from
Hmm.
when they or what they were applying for. And over the years, I had lots of young people who had been to film school who would come to me and say, I want to produce documentaries. It seemed that most graduates of such places wanted to produce documentaries. No one ever came to me and said, I want to produce soap opera for social change. Now,
Hmm.
we found some people to do it, but there was no inclination. And to my mind, um, documentaries tend to be one-off things. Drama tends to be multi-episode, and the repetition is quite important. It seems to me, and I wish we had more interest in drama for social change.
Yes, no, I agree 100%. I did my dissertation research in Bosnian arts and peace building, and looked at film. I didn't look at television, but film and
Yeah.
music, and I looked more at film and music. But just it's amazing the power of art. I mean, art can also exacerbate. So obviously, lots of. I remember being in former Yugoslavia. I wasn't in the fighting areas, but during when the war first broke out, and just watching the demonization on Serbian TV of Kosovars, So I mean, film and media is not always positive; it can equally go the other way. But a question there is one I've been to some of the countries that Search has worked in and know some of the staff, and I have been to when I guess they call it Northern Macedonia, but former Yugoslav Republic of Macedonia. And in the book, you talk a lot about Naša Malo and the bilingual kindergartens, and basically the both the Naša Malo was Sesame Street workshop helped with it, and really became this national phenomenon that was showed on TV in a country that had a lot of the conditions that could have led to extreme violent conflict, like in Croatia or Bosnia. So, can you talk a little bit like what makes for good edu drama or soap operas? And the second question, because at one point in the book you talk about, I think it's DFID. I mean, it's almost in the book. A lot of times it sounds like I'm sure you had lots of ideas in your team where the money didn't show up, because you talk about that stress of there was no money to pay the bills, or someone just contributed. You were talking about, I don't know if it was the wrestling exchange in Iran, but just like sometimes the idea was there and the money wasn't, or somehow magically the right amount would show up. But you do talk about, I think DFID or maybe it was USA gave you $6 million to funding to help really do large scale media programming. So one, if you can talk a little bit about Nasha Malo or Madam President or the team. But the second question, is it possible to do edu drama or soap operas for change and make it commercially viable that actually could be profitable, or you always need that kind of philanthropic capital?
There are a lot of questions there, and what in Macedonia, um, we did a drama series for children, uh, which was called Nashimalo, or Our Neighborhood, and it had it grew out of the fact that our country director there, Ron Frankel, had a 4-year-old daughter who was watching local television, which was terrible. They were showing cartoons only, which were dubbed from German or United or English, and we wanted to do. He wanted to do something better for his daughter and for all the children of Macedonia. Unfortunately, by the time it got on the air, his daughter was too old for the show. But we were able to do something that reached, I believe, over 90% of the children in Macedonia. And because there was very little original programming there, the adults used to watch it with the children. So we reached a substantial percentage of adults too. And Nashimalo became a national ideal. And when they did a thorough evaluation program, they found that people said, we would like to act like they act in Nashimalo, but the fact is sometimes we're not up to it. But we set a national ideal that 20 years later still is the national ideal. And I think it contributed to Macedonia not becoming like Bosnia or Serbia, where hate and violence ruled. Now they're off that. But the fact is, Macedonia never exploded in a meaningful way. Um, and that was quite important, it seemed to me. And we found that in other countries, you could bring together a substantial portion of the population around a popular show that had good values. In Palestine, we got half the households in the country. In other words, we had 50% ratings, and you couldn't do that in most countries, but in Palestine, we were able to do that. And so yeah, we felt that attitudes and behaviors could be shifted, and that Nashimalo and shows like it were quite important in making this happen.
Okay. And can this type of media, do you have examples from Search's work where this is commercially viable, or it always takes some kind of government or philanthropic capital?
Well, if in the underdeveloped world, you probably do need the philanthropic or government connection. Our model, which we was one reason we never were able to come into Western Europe or the United States, was to get money from foreign aid agencies to pay for this kind of programming. Uh, from governments or international organizations. It could be commercially viable. It's just different. The TV production market is very different in the West than it is in the South.
Mhm.
And
Are,
we used to
are
find that in Israel and Palestine because Israel had a what you might call a first world TV market, and in Palestine it was more of a one in a less developed world, and so getting cooperative projects going was not so easy because you had apples and oranges on the two different sides, but we were successful.
are you aware? I'm not of any of the streaming channels doing, whether it's Amazon or Apple or Netflix, doing supporting or investing. I mean, Colombia. One of the nice things about Netflix is a lot of Colombian series have been made that are reaching the not just Latin America, they're reaching the world, and that's really interesting. But are you aware of anyone doing this on a streaming channel with this at least part of this purpose?
Let's just say I've tried and never been very
Okay.
successful.
Yes, that's a little bit of plug if anybody happens to go ahead.
Yeah, yeah. No, I think that commercially this stuff could be just as effective. It depends on the quality of the writers, it depends
Yeah,
on the quality of the production. It has really very little to do with the with whether it's going to bring about social change.
yeah.
But
Mhm.
you need an acceptance of the basic premises in the broadcasters area. And
Right,
most broadcasters do not like it when outsiders, particularly people in the nonprofit sector, come to them with ideas. Uh,
right.
so yes, you can have it, and you could have much more, but we don't.
Yeah. I mean, it's also sad participant media, after I think 15 or 20 years is stopping. I mean, Jeff Skoll and participant media were helping support feature films that often, you know, addressed really relevant social issues, not the serious soap operas for change, but, the last one I forgot was the teacher from Mexico. It's a documentary. I think it's fiction, but it's amazing if anyone hasn't seen that. I forgot,
Right?
but,
Won an
they,
Academy Award.
yeah, it's an amazing film. And they've produced, but I don't know the reasons why, but they're shutting down or shut down. So,
Well, they were unfortunately, they are shut down now or shutting down, but they ran under the same sun on American television, something we produced. And that was the one place we ever had
mhm,
any success in what you're saying. And
yes.
it really is too bad.
A few more questions, and if anyone else has other comments or questions, feel free to put them in the chat. So, if I mean, one of the things I like about the book is also so much of your reflection, and you have a lot of humor in there. And I, the German word, when you talk about the Dunbar effect, which I've heard you say before, but I didn't know the story about. I forgot the guy's name, Peter, and his dog. So can you? I love that that phrase, because a lot of we've heard about be agile, but explain what the Dunbar effect is and your recommendations for others.
Well, we had a guy come to us for a job named Peter, and he was blind, and he had a service dog named Dunbar. And let's just say we had never hired a person before who was blind. So I had a lot of questions I had to ask about. Um, could he use our computers? Would he have any problem getting to work? Would Dunbar be able to spend the day with him without fouling in the office? And those kinds of things. And he answered them all satisfactorily, and we hired him. But there was one question I didn't think to ask him because it just didn't occur to me. And that was, is anyone in the office allergic to dogs? The answer to that question was yes. And it was my assistant, who I didn't want to, let's just say, freak out or lose because we'd hired a guy with a service dog. And we found a workaround. The workaround is we put Peter in an office that was far as possible away from my assistant, and we made sure if there was a meeting between when Peter was participating in and I was participating, most people used to come to my office because I was president of the organization. I would go to Peter's office and make sure that Dunbar didn't come anywhere near my assistant, and that kind of thing. Well, the what I call the Dunbar principle, you remember Dunbar was the dog, is that there are going to be questions you didn't ask because you didn't think to ask. It just didn't occur to you. I'm a dog lover. I grew up with dogs. I had dogs as an adult. It just never occurred to me. Now, if I were hiring somebody who was blind and who had a service dog, I would ask in my own office, is anyone allergic to dogs? But this is going to happen all the time. It seems to me when you're in the social entrepreneur conflict resolution business, things are going to come up that you just didn't think were possible. Unexpected events, things that, and there's nothing you can do except know that that's going to happen and not be freaked out when it does happen and be prepared to come up with workarounds like put Dunbar as far away as possible from my assistant.
And the last tip, and you said this many years ago at Georgetown. I didn't write down the German word frugen, about kind of having a sense of things. The German word frugen. I was going to write it down, but I forgot to. Your last tip around kind of us being. So can you say the word and explain what it means?
It's the word is Fingerspitzengefühl,
Yeah.
and it means to have a tip, a sense at the end of your fingers, an intuitive sense of where you might be going. To take on this project, not that project, to work in this place, not that place, and just to know. And I also caution that I say it's very important to have that intuitive sense, but you don't want to be overwhelmed by it. You don't want it to be the sole factor. You need to find a balance between your cognitive intellectual processes and your sense of Fingerspitzengefühl.
Mm-hmm.
And it's important to have both. It's not an either or proposition. It's a both and.
And just not to get into love stories, but I didn't know. I knew a little of the story how you and Susan met, but it's true in the book that you talk about were invited or went to South Africa to work on I forgot the name of the video series on on kind of the
South
transition. And
Africa searches for common ground.
yeah, and then you mentioned, was it to Hans Siebert or somebody else that you were, that if you were, they asked if you were married and you said no, but you're open to a beautiful mediator, and that's that's the was that Hans Siebert or someone else who made that introduction? I can't remember the name.
It was Hannah Siebert,
Okay.
and I said he asked me was I married, and I said something I had never said before. I said I'm divorced, but I'm looking, and he said, "What are you looking for?" And I said, "A
Yeah.
tall, beautiful mediator."
Yeah.
And he introduced me to Susan the next day, and
Yeah.
let's just say that 30 years later, we're still very happily married.
Yes. Yes. It's a great love story. So you might
Mhm.
that could be another thing. So the last two questions, one you talk about Bill Drayton, you're an Ashoka fellow. So for people interested in the wider world of social entrepreneurship, obviously please get the book. It comes out next week. We'll put the link again. But where else do you encourage people to go to understand the world of social entrepreneurship and the opportunities and jobs and funding? Obviously Skoll and Ashoka are two of the best organizations, but where else do you recommend people go?
Well, I think that the essence of social entrepreneurship is to come from your own gut.
Hmm.
In other words, to have a vision. I mean, there are organizations like that will support you in the beginning if you have a strong enough idea. But the idea and the way of implementing needs to come from the individual. And I don't see Echoing Green, for example, will support you if as you're in the in your startup phase, and there are others that will do that. But the key to it, to being successful in the social entrepreneurship business, is to be willing to commit yourself 100% to making it happen and have that creative entrepreneurial spirit that allows you to be successful.
Yeah, yeah, and it requires a little bit of insanity and vision, and as you said, it's a very bumpy ride. So I think it's also important not to. A colleague wrote a book on the danger of hero worship of like the soul. Yeah. So it's also important to keep the balance. There's a lot of burnout and challenges. It's not all wonderful. There's a lot of good things, but it's not all perfect.
No, I
Um,
think if I had known how difficult it was going to be, I'm not even sure I would have started.
right.
Uh, in
Yes.
other words, it's not an easy ride, particularly in the beginning.
Yeah.
You are the float in the organization in the sense you're the only one that will work for without pay. And
Yeah.
in the beginning, there were times we didn't have enough money to pay me, and
Yep.
that was posed certain problems. But my vision went out, and I kept going, and I didn't stop. And I was lucky I had a little family, a little family money, which is an advantage that not everybody has. But it was very fortunate for me.
Right. And then my last question, we talked some about when you meet with skeptics around peace building, do you have any favorite data or stories that obviously we're talking about the Aikido perspective, you don't want to hit people over the head, but just like the things that have worked most consistently for you when you're meeting people who are very skeptical and just say peace is a bunch of hippies hugging trees and it's like this state we'll never get to. I mean, obviously everything is context specific, but what have you found in terms of stories or data to show that this, because military interventions often don't work and wars often don't work. I mean, the idea is like, it's very tangible, like bomb or attack or take out, but the long-term consequences of war often don't lead to, they're not desirable in the short term or long term. So any thoughts about kind of not the moral argument, but the data or the stories, how to elevate that peace or peace building does and can work as effectively as war?
Well, I don't have any data, but I
Mm-hmm.
do think that telling stories about successes in other places is quite a useful thing. Um,
Mm-hmm.
and I think being there in a pre violence stage is very important. In other words, preventive diplomacy, preventive conflict resolution is much more effective than trying to bring peace once the violence starts. And beforehand, as the old saying goes, a stitch in time can save nine. Once the violence starts, it's usually too late and people don't have any opening for it. Now, there's a place at the very end where the people have reached a sense of total exhaustion, and then there could be a stitching back together. But being in there, anticipating the conflict. Now, unfortunately, the people who control the purse strings and the money that supports conflict resolution don't usually want to work in the preventive area. Oh, they say they do, but they don't. What they need to do is go into a place like Syria, where the war is already going on. Now, that war would have been much better handled and dealt with before it became a war. Um, and the get early timing and being able to move. I wish that governments had put aside a department for prevention rather than for what they call conflict resolution, which tends to be after the fact, moving into places and helping rebuild someplace. And that's important. I'm not saying take it away, but there also needs to be substantial resources for prevention. And if you could have prevented the war anywhere, I mean, it's going to cost billions to rebuild Gaza now. If that could have been somehow prevented for, say, even millions or hundreds of millions, the world would have saved a huge amount of money. So it's economical. But the fact is, you don't know if it's effective in advance, and governments tend to move from crisis to crisis.
Yeah, I mean, Paul Collier many years ago came out with the estimate the average civil war, at least in parts of Africa, is $64 billion cost. I mean, that doesn't include the human cost, but war is not cost effective neither in any terms. My last two questions. Can you say a little bit about what Confluence International does, and then the last question: what's the best channel for people to follow you on? Is it LinkedIn, or do you have a website, or just if they want to stay up to date on the type of work you're engaged with?
I set up Confluence International essentially as a way to do my own work, to have a place to stand. And we've produced a television series in Kenya, co produced it, called Ms. President, which was about having a woman elected the next president of Kenya. It's a reality series with an American Idol type
Mm-hmm.
elimination format. But Confluence International is not a functioning organization that I'm particularly interested in having people keep up with. It's a way for me at 81 years old to keep working in the world
Mm-hmm.
and for me to do my projects. And so I'm on LinkedIn, but I'm not an active social media person. And I think the way to keep up is to read the book.
Okay. So thank you so much for sharing your time and energy and wisdom. And again, for people, if this is your first time, this will be out as a podcast on Friday. Please check out the book. We'll add the links to the podcast show notes. It's available September 3rd from Columbia University Press. Please consider sharing this episode or the 150 other episodes. We have an amazing season coming up. Please follow John on LinkedIn, PCDN, and any last comments before we end? And thank you again so much for your time.
No, but thank you for doing this, and thank you for your commitment to this kind of
Okay.
work.
Okay. Thank you so much, and have a wonderful afternoon in Amsterdam. So it's morning here. And thank you so much, John. Have a great day. And thank you, everyone, for